The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses filled the air inside La Bella Vita, the most elegant Italian restaurant tucked away in the heart of Charleston. The afternoon sun poured through the tall arched windows, casting golden halos around the heads of about 50 guests who had gathered to celebrate Amelia Carter's graduation. I sat near the center table, watching my daughter's face glow with excitement, her deep blue dress, the one we had picked together just a week ago, fluttering slightly as she laughed. My heart, at 52, felt as full and proud as it had ever been. For a brief, beautiful moment, everything seemed perfect. Then Grant Carter, my husband of 26 years, rose from his chair. I turned to him, expecting a toast, some sentimental words to mark this milestone. Around the room, conversations hushed, forks paused mid-air, glasses lowered to the white tablecloths. Everyone looked toward Grant, their faces lit with anticipation. Amelia beamed at her father, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Grant raised his champagne flute, clearing his throat. But the words that came out were not of pride nor of joy. "I've decided to start a new life without Evelyn," he said, clearly, his voice cutting through the celebration like a shard of broken glass. The room froze. A fork clattered to the floor somewhere to my right. I heard a soft gasp from one of my friends seated nearby, the kind of gasp you make when watching a slow-motion car crash but being unable to turn away. I felt, more than saw, every pair of eyes shift to me, waiting for the eruption, the shouting, maybe even the cinematic slap across the face they'd expect from a scene like this. But I did none of that. I simply blinked once, twice, as the words sank into the warm, festive air and turned it icy cold. Grant stood awkwardly, his glass trembling slightly in his hand, daring me to react, bracing himself for the chaos he thought he had unleashed. I could see the fear flicker in his eyes when he realized I wasn't moving according to his script. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my plate. Then, with the same calm precision, I pulled a cream-colored envelope from my purse and set it on the table in front of him. My voice, when it came, was steady enough for everyone to hear, cutting cleanly through the heavy silence. "This is a gift for you," I said. Grant's brow furrowed in confusion, his hand hesitating mid-air above the envelope. I leaned down and kissed Amelia on the forehead, whispering in her ear, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Today is your day. Don't let anyone steal it." Her wide brown eyes, so like my own, shimmered with unshed tears as she stared at me, confused, heartbroken. I squeezed her hand briefly, then straightened up, smoothing the skirt of my pale blue dress. Turning to the room, I smiled. A gracious, unbreakable smile. The kind you were not because you're unaffected, but because you refuse to let them see you bleed. The faces that had once crowded our Christmas dinners, who had laughed at my kitchen table, now looked away, studying their plates or the centerpiece, ashamed. Because they knew. They all knew about Vanessa Brooks, the girl 20 years younger who used to call me Sis when she visited during holidays. I took a slow breath, allowing myself to feel the coolness of it inside my chest. Then I said with a voice that was both steel and silk, "Please enjoy the rest of the afternoon. It's a beautiful day for a celebration." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, the sound echoing in the stunned silence behind me like the tolling of a final bell. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. I knew they were watching. Every step, every movement, realizing too late that the woman they had pitted was not the one who would crumble. When the heavy door swung shut behind me, and the June heat of Charleston wrapped around my skin like a slap, I finally allowed myself to exhale, not a sob, not a sigh of pain, but a breath of freedom. Behind me, I heard the crash of the door flying open. Grant's voice, no longer confident but frantic, tearing into the quiet street. "Evelyn, Evelyn, what are you doing? Are you crazy?" I kept walking, the envelope still warm from my hand, now burning in his. He had no idea that while he had been preparing to humiliate me, I had already written the ending to his story. And it started today. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time long ago, it seemed now, when Grant and I had been partners in the truest sense. We had built a life together from nothing, braving sleepless nights, tight budgets, and silent prayers for a better future. Or at least, I had believed we were building it together. The first crack in that illusion appeared on an ordinary January evening, 6 months before Amelia's graduation. Grant was, as usual, working late. A client meeting in Hilton Head, he said, though the tone in his voice had started to carry a rehearsed flatness that I couldn't ignore. I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the year-end bank statements, my plan simple. Check the numbers, pay a few lingering bills, and maybe, for once, allow myself a glass of wine without worry. I wasn't even looking for anything. Not really. Maybe some part of me still wanted to believe. But there it was, a small charge from a jewelry store in Atlanta, a place we had never shopped at, a place he hadn't mentioned. A cold sensation, like the slow creep of winter frost, spread through my veins. Grant wasn't a jewelry man, and it certainly wasn't a gift for me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the transaction. A tiny seed of dread rooted itself deep inside me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a client gift? Maybe an innocent explanation? But as I paged deeper into the statement, the seed began to sprout twisted branches. There were more charges. Fancy restaurants, hotel stays in cities Grant had never spoken about, random airline tickets, purchased for two, always two. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the folder. My first instinct was to call him, demand answers, force the truth into the light. But some wiser, colder part of me, the part that had grown through years of disappointments carefully smoothed over by for the sake of family, whispered otherwise. No, not yet. That night, when Grant returned home smelling faintly of hotel soap and a brand of cologne he never used to wear, I greeted him with a warm smile and a glass of Cabernet. I asked him about his meeting, listened to his rehearsed answers, and nodded like the loyal wife I had been trained to be. But inside, something monumental shifted. I would not confront him. I would not scream or beg or cry. I would wait. A week later, my patience was rewarded. Grant, careless as ever, left his iPad unlocked on the sofa. I found it blinking awake as I straightened the living room, an open message thread illuminating the screen like a beacon. Vanessa Brooks, her name, so bright, so grotesquely familiar, stared back at me, along with a series of messages dripping with promises of a new life. A beach house, endless nights, freedom, passion, lies. My heart didn't break, not the way you would expect. It hardened. I closed the iPad gently, placed it back on the coffee table as if it had never been disturbed, and made 2 phone calls. One to Margaret Maggie Lawson, a divorce attorney I'd met years ago at a women's finance seminar, and one to Jason Hart, an old friend of my brother's who worked as a private investigator. If Grant thought I would simply collapse, he had underestimated me. Maggie wasted no time. Over steaming cups of coffee in her sunlit office, she flipped through the original prenuptial agreement that Grant had once insisted upon before our marriage, back when I had the stronger financial standing, when he had been the one worried about betrayal. Clause 17, she pointed out almost smiling, in the event of proven infidelity, the innocent party shall retain majority ownership of all marital assets, including real estate, investments, and retirement accounts. A weapon, signed in Grant's own confident hand 2.5 decades ago, now gleamed sharp and ready in mine. Meanwhile, Jason's reports began to pour in like clockwork. Photos of Grant and Vanessa holding hands at resorts, sharing private dinners under fake names, disappearing into hotel elevators late at night. I documented everything. I made backups. I created detailed spreadsheets of financial discrepancies, secret accounts, and hidden transactions. I became a ghost in my own marriage, smiling through dinners, laughing at family gatherings, pretending nothing had changed, while beneath the surface, Every step I took led me closer to freedom. The decision to wait until Amelia's graduation wasn't easy. Part of me burned with the need for confrontation, but Maggie advised patience. Let him hang himself in public, she said with quiet steel in her voice. Let them all see exactly who he really is. And so I waited. Every morning, I slipped the cream-colored envelope into my purse before leaving the house. A silent reminder, a loaded weapon tucked carefully out of sight. I rehearsed the moment 100 times in my mind, what I would say, how I would move, the calm that would coat my words like ice over fire. I would not scream. I would not cry. I would destroy him with nothing more than the truth. And when the day finally came, when Grant stood up at Amelia's graduation party and delivered his carefully timed betrayal, I didn't flinch, because while he had spent months crafting his exit, I had spent months crafting his downfall. The heat outside hit me like a wall as I stepped onto the cobblestone sidewalk, the golden late afternoon sun of Charleston pressing against my skin. I welcomed it. The burn of the air was nothing compared to the fire that had been simmering inside me for months, waiting for this very moment. Behind me, the door to La Bella Vita slammed open so violently it echoed down the narrow street. Evelyn, stop! Grant's voice, once smooth and commanding, now cracked with panic and disbelief. I didn't stop. My heels clicked against the stone, steady and deliberate. With each step, I felt the chains I had carried for decades fall away, clattering onto the ground behind me, useless, broken. I heard him stumble down the restaurant steps, his hurried footsteps pounding closer. His breath was ragged, desperate. You're not thinking straight. You can't just walk away like this, he shouted. I reached the edge of the sidewalk where the summer blooms from a nearby flower shop perfumed the heavy air. Slowly I turned around. Grant skidded to a halt a few feet from me, clutching the cream-colored envelope like it was some kind of lifeline he didn't yet understand he was already losing. His cheeks were flushed, his forehead beaded with sweat, his tailored suit suddenly looking far too tight around the shoulders. What the hell is this? He barked, waving the envelope as if shaking it would change its contents. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. Not the man I had married, or the father of my child, or the charming businessman he pretended to be. Just a man, small, desperate, and now finally exposed. Just giving you what you've worked so hard for, I said lightly, my voice carrying easily on the humid breeze. Grant ripped the envelope open, his fingers clumsy, yanking out the thick stack of papers inside. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, fear. His hands trembled so violently that some of the pages slipped from his grasp, fluttering onto the sidewalk. Evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, petition for divorce, he choked out, his voice dropping into a stunned whisper. How did you? How long? I crossed my arms calmly. Sometimes all it takes is one person being careless and the other being patient. He looked up at me then, a wild, furious glint in his eyes. You can't use this against me. The prenup expired. You have nothing. I smiled, a slow, knowing smile that tasted of long-awaited justice. You should have read it more carefully before you signed it, Grant. Clause 17. It remains valid throughout the marriage. You insisted on it back then, remember? Afraid someone would take advantage of you. I took a step closer, low enough so that only he could hear the next words, even if everyone inside the restaurant was surely still straining to listen. And now, ironically, it protects me. Grant staggered back a half step as if I had struck him. His grip tightened around the documents until the edges crumpled under his fingers. But what about the house? The retirement accounts? The investments? He rasped, his face draining of color. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think, even though I knew every detail by heart. The house in Charleston? Mine. 70% of our joint assets? Mine. The personal account you thought you hid under a fake business name? Frozen. He shook his head violently, backing further away, as if physical distance could undo the trap that had already snapped shut around him. No, no, you can't do this to me. Vanessa and I, we had plans. A new life. A new house. His voice broke in a pitiful, ugly sob. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the late afternoon sun blaze against my skin like armor. Your new life, I said softly, will begin in a rented apartment funded by the scraps the court will allow you. Vanessa might want to start looking elsewhere. The words landed like stones thrown into a shallow pond, leaving ripples of devastation across his crumbling facade. Grant looked utterly shattered, clutching the papers like they were the last remnants of a dream gone sour. His shoulders sagged, his mouth opening and closing without sound. For a fleeting second, a mere flicker, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered every lonely night, every lie, every smile he gave another woman while pretending to be mine. And whatever mercy might have stirred inside me vanished like mist under the Charleston sun. A taxi pulled up to the curb, its engine humming quietly. Without sparing Grant another glance, I raised my hand and stepped toward it. As I opened the car door, I turned back one last time. I once loved you with everything I had, I said, my voice low and final. But you threw it away for a fantasy. From now on, Grant, you're on your own. I slid into the back seat, pulling the door shut with a quiet, definitive click. As the taxi pulled away, I looked through the rear window and saw him standing there, alone on the sidewalk, crumpled papers scattered at his feet, his face hollowed by the weight of his own choices. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel grief. I felt free. By the time I arrived back at the house, the sun had dipped low over Charleston, bathing the red bricks and iron balconies of the historic district in a molten gold. It should have been a comforting sight, a place that once symbolized home, family, security. Instead, it felt like walking into a mausoleum of a life that no longer belonged to me. I set my purse down on the worn oak table by the front door and turned on a single lamp in the living room. The soft, warm light spilled across the walls, illuminating the countless family photos Grant and I had hung over the years. A smiling Amelia at 3, covered in chocolate cake, Grant lifting her onto his shoulders at a county fair. The three of us posing proudly in front of this very house when we first bought it. I stared at those photos for a long moment, not with sadness, not even anger, just a kind of quiet finality, as if saying goodbye to ghosts. I had just settled onto the couch, pulling my laptop into my lap to review the final paperwork Maggie had sent, when the front door slammed open with a force that rattled the frame. Evelyn. Grant's voice tore through the house like a thunderclap. I heard the sharp, heavy thud of his shoes crossing the floor, each step filled with frantic, clumsy energy. I closed my laptop slowly and placed it on the coffee table. Then I sat back, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and waited. Grant stumbled into the living room, his face a storm of anger, fear, and confusion. He clutched the crumpled envelope and documents against his chest like a drowning man clutching driftwood. "You can't do this," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You can't just tear everything apart over one mistake." I tilted my head slightly, studying him as if he were a stranger who had wandered into my home. "Sit down," I said, my voice smooth, unyielding. But he didn't sit. He paced back and forth, like a caged animal, running his hands through his disheveled hair, muttering under his breath. "They canceled the lease," he blurted suddenly, turning toward me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The apartment Vanessa and I were going to rent, they just called. Said my application was denied. Something about suspicious financial activity." I leaned back into the couch, crossing my legs leisurely. "That's because your credit file was flagged," I said coolly. "Several unexplained transactions triggered a fraud alert. The brokerage firm called the house phone to verify." I answered. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "And that's not all," I continued, my voice slicing cleanly through the thick, tense air. That secret account you hid under the fake consultancy business? It's frozen under a temporary court order. You have no liquidity, Grant. No collateral. Nothing. He stumbled backward, collapsing into the armchair across from me, burying his face in his hands. The sight of him, this man who once strutted through life so sure of himself, now reduced to a heap of regret and broken pride, was almost surreal. I just wanted a better life, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Vanessa and I, we had plans. We were going to start over. Then start, I said, my voice as gentle as a scalpel. Start by paying rent on time. Start by covering your own electric bills. Start by living with the consequences you created. Grant looked up at me then, his face twisted with anger and desperation. You're ruining my life over one mistake. I laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that didn't reach my eyes. Forgetting a birthday is a mistake, Grant. Leaving a coat at a restaurant is a mistake. Cheating on your wife, hiding money, planning a life with another woman while pretending to be a family man? That's not a mistake. That's a series of choices. Each word struck him like a blow, and I could see it, the dawning horror, the realization that there would be no redemption arc for him, no last-minute save. I need money, he rasped finally, as if stating it could somehow reset the world. I crossed my arms, my expression unchanging. You had money. You had a family. You had everything. And you threw it away for a fantasy. Now you can learn what it's like to stand on your own. He flinched, as if I had physically slapped him. Then, barely above a whisper, he asked, Does Amelia know? Not yet, I replied. But she will. And when she does, you'll be the one explaining why her graduation day became the day her world changed. Grant sagged deeper into the chair, his body folding into itself, a man crushed under the rubble of his own making. I stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress, and picked up my keys from the table. You have 2 days to pack your things, I said, my voice clear and final. After that, the locks will be changed. You'll need to find another place to start your new life. Without another glance, I walked toward the door, the soft click of my heels punctuating the silence. As I closed the door behind me, I left him there, alone, surrounded by the wreckage he had built, with nothing left but the sound of his own shallow breathing. Outside, the summer night was warm and heavy, the cicadas humming their endless song, and for the first time in years, every step I took felt lighter than the last. Claire's house sat under a canopy of ancient oak trees just outside downtown Charleston, the pale blue shingles glowing softly under the porch light. When I pulled into her driveway that night, the weight of the day seemed to finally ease off my shoulders. Claire had been the only one in Grant's family who never bought into the facade, the only one who had quietly watched and, when needed, stood firmly on my side. She met me at the door before I could even knock, her face tight with worry, her arms opening in silent invitation. Are you okay? She asked as she hugged me tightly. Better than you think, I replied with a smile that felt strange and new on my face, a smile that wasn't stretched thin by pretending anymore. Inside, the house smelled of mint tea and old hardwood floors. We sat in the living room, nursing steaming mugs of tea between our hands, the silence between us warm and comforting. I texted Amelia, who was still out celebrating with her friends, letting her know that everything was fine and that we would talk later. She didn't need this moment tarnished any more than it already had been. I had just started to relax when the doorbell rang, loud and insistent, shattering the fragile calm. Claire and I exchanged a glance. She set down her cup and moved to the door cautiously. I stayed seated, my fingers tightening around the warm, ceramic mug. Heavy footsteps stormed across the hardwood floor, even before Claire could fully open the door. Grant, and trailing behind him, looking small and out of place in her sleek, expensive dress, was Vanessa Brooks. Grant looked wrecked. His tie was gone, his shirt rumpled and half untucked, his face hollowed with desperation. Vanessa, in contrast, tried to hold onto some shred of dignity, but her darting eyes and trembling hands betrayed her. I remained seated, watching them with a calm detachment, as if observing a scene from a play I had seen too many times to be affected by it now. "Don't bother stepping inside," Claire said firmly, crossing her arms and blocking the entrance to the living room. Grant ignored her. His eyes locked onto me, wild and pleading. "Evelyn, we need to talk." "We've talked enough," I replied coolly, not bothering to rise from my seat. Vanessa shifted awkwardly beside him, glancing around as if searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to find herself on the outside looking in. The back door creaked open, and Amelia entered, her graduation gown now replaced by jeans and a simple blouse. She froze at the sight of her father and Vanessa standing in the doorway, the tension in the room crackling like static. "What are you doing here, Dad?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard before. "I just wanted to explain," Grant stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Explain what?" Amelia snapped, her eyes blazing. "Explain how you turned my graduation day into a public humiliation? Or how you betrayed Mom after everything she gave up for you?" Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand twitched helplessly at his side. Vanessa touched his arm, a nervous, desperate gesture, but he shook her off, stepping closer to Amelia. "I'm still your father," he said hoarsely. "That doesn't change." Amelia laughed, a short, humorless sound that sliced through the heavy air. "Don't use father to excuse your choices." The room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. And then Vanessa, her voice shaking, added the final blow. "The money you promised for our new apartment," she said, turning on Grant. "You said it was already transferred. But I called the bank today. The account's frozen." Grant turned pale, his mouth working uselessly. "You lied to me," Vanessa said, her voice breaking. "You promised me a new life, but you couldn't even deliver that." Grant tried to reach for her, but Vanessa stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "What else were you lying about?" she asked, her voice rising with each word. "How much of everything you told me was just smoke and mirrors?" Grant said nothing. In that silence, Vanessa's face crumpled as the realization settled in. She had bet everything on a man who had nothing left to give. "I was such a fool," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Without another word, she turned and fled through the door, her departure punctuated by the heavy slam that rattled the windows. Amelia watched her go, then turned back to Grant, her expression filled with something far worse than anger, disappointment. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," she said quietly. "But right now, I just want you to leave." Grant's shoulders slumped as if the words physically crushed him. He opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to excuse, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, a slow, broken movement, and shuffled out the door, the same door Vanessa had slammed moments before. When it closed behind him, Claire came over and placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. Amelia crossed the room and sat beside me, resting her head against my shoulder like she used to when she was little. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was healing. A new beginning had quietly taken its first breath in the ruins Grant had left behind. 3 weeks later, the skies over Charleston hung heavy with gray clouds, casting a somber shadow over the small historic courthouse where the preliminary hearing was about to begin. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded neatly, my breathing even, my heart steady. Beside me, Margaret Maga Lawson, my attorney, adjusted her silver glasses and offered me a small, confident nod. She had dressed in a sharp navy suit, her every movement exuding an effortless authority that filled the room even before the judge entered. Across the aisle sat Grant. Gone was the man who had once walked into a room with swagger and charm. He fidgeted in his seat, tugging nervously at the frayed strap of his worn leather watch. His face was paler, thinner, as if the weeks of scrambling and losing had worn him down to something brittle and hollow. Next to him sat a young lawyer. A boy, really, who looked barely old enough to rent a car, let alone defend a complicated divorce case involving prenuptial agreements and financial misconduct. Maggie leaned closer to me, her voice a low murmur. "Don't worry," she said, her lips curving into a faint, almost amused smile. He brought a lamb to a wolf's den. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the judge entered, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She rapped her gavel once and motioned for opening statements. Maggie rose smoothly. She spoke with clarity, without a hint of drama or embellishment, laying out the facts like iron rails. The prenuptial agreement, she explained, was still legally binding. Grant had breached the fidelity clause. The financial misconduct, backed by clear documentation, was substantial enough to warrant the freezing of all marital assets until final division could be ruled. She presented the evidence, financial records, photographs, private investigator reports, all meticulously organized and irrefutable. When she finished, the room seemed to exhale, a collective sense that something inevitable had just rolled into motion. Grant's young lawyer stood next, visibly swallowing hard before speaking. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "we argue that the prenuptial agreement has lapsed over time due to lack of renewal or review, and thus—" The judge's hand shot up, silencing him mid-sentence. Without even glancing at him, she flipped through the thick file in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a long, tense moment, she spoke. "Clause 17, she said crisply, tapping the page with her pen, states clearly that the agreement remains in effect throughout the marriage and any dissolution proceedings. No expiration date is indicated. This argument is dismissed." The young lawyer flushed bright red, his mouth opening and closing uselessly. The judge closed the file with a sharp thud that echoed through the small room. "The court finds the prenuptial agreement valid," she declared, her voice as final as a slammed door. "The plaintiff has provided sufficient evidence of a serious breach of fidelity. Marital assets will remain frozen pending final division." Grant slumped visibly in his seat, his body curling inward like a dying leaf. "And regarding residence," the judge continued, barely sparing him a glance, "the plaintiff, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, shall have temporary exclusive use and management of the marital home. The defendant shall have access only to his personal account, limited to essential living expenses." Grant's lawyer stammered, trying to object, but the judge shut him down with a raised hand and a cold stare. "I have reviewed the transaction records," she said sharply. "The defendant's behavior necessitates protection of the plaintiff from further financial loss." Maggie smiled faintly, as if she had anticipated every move before it even happened. She gathered our papers neatly, not a hair out of place. The gavel struck the bench again. The hearing was adjourned. I stood, smoothing my dress, feeling a sense of quiet triumph settle deep in my bones. Grant remained frozen, staring down at the scuffed wood of the defense table as if trying to sink into it. As I walked past him toward the exit, I heard his footsteps scramble behind me, quick and hesitant. "Evelyn." "Please," he croaked, his voice breaking. I stopped and turned, meeting his desperate, hollowed-out gaze with calm, steady eyes. "We once loved each other," he said, the words spilling out as if they might still mean something. "I did love you," I said, my voice quiet but sharp as glass. "But I love myself more now. And loving myself means not forgiving betrayal." Grant opened his mouth, but nothing came. His shoulders sagged further, his figure folding in on itself like a house collapsing after the foundation rots away. I turned and walked down the courthouse hallway, the echo of my footsteps a steady drumbeat in the heavy silence behind me. Outside, a soft drizzle had started to fall, the rain kissing the cobblestone streets in soft, rhythmic taps. I stood under the old iron awning for a moment, breathing in the clean, wet air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. Today wasn't just about a courtroom win. It was about reclaiming the life I had given away for far too long. News travels fast in Charleston. Faster still when it's about a once respected man falling from grace. Within weeks of the preliminary hearing, the whispered rumors that had hovered on the fringes of our social circles turned into cold, undeniable facts. Grant Carter, once the life of every charity gala, the golden boy of every networking event, had become little more than a cautionary tale. Lauren Brooks, the woman he'd gambled everything on, packed her designer bags and left within days of the court freezing his assets. A mutual friend told me she'd been overheard at a bar downtown, muttering bitterly into her drink, "I didn't sign up to love a broke man." Grant's fledgling real estate consultancy, which he had once boasted would turn him into a mogul, collapsed almost overnight. With no financial backing, no goodwill left in the community, and no allies willing to throw him a lifeline, the company office was emptied within a month. The sign above the door, once gleaming in bold letters, was hastily removed. A flimsy for lease notice took its place. Friends, or those who had once called themselves that, evaporated like dew in the morning sun. No more golf outings. No more lavish dinners at waterfront restaurants. No more Sunday brunches filled with hollow laughter. Grant had spent years building a life of appearances, and when the foundation cracked, the entire facade crumbled. Some acquaintances, emboldened by his downfall, reached out to me tentatively, trying to reforge connections they had long neglected. I answered their calls with polite indifference, declining every coffee invite, every just catching up text message. They hadn't stood beside me when I needed them. I had no use for them now. While Grant floundered in the wreckage he had created, I began piecing together something far more meaningful. It started small. A modest office space on the second floor of an old brick building in historic downtown Charleston. A sun-drenched corner overlooking a park where the oak trees dripped Spanish moss, and the scent of magnolias filled the air. I signed the lease with a trembling hand, equal parts fear and exhilaration bubbling in my chest. On the frosted glass door, I placed a simple name, Evelyn Carter Life Strategies. I wasn't just building a business. I was building a lifeline for myself and for other women who had been blindsided by life's brutal turns. At first, I took on only a few clients, women navigating divorce, widowhood, sudden career shifts, sitting across from me with tear-streaked faces and trembling hands, not knowing where to begin. I knew that fear. I had lived that fear. "We'll start right where you are," I would tell them gently, "and you won't have to walk it alone." Word spread quickly. Lawyers began referring clients. Therapists, too. Even women who had heard my story in hushed circles came through my door, not for gossip, but for guidance. Within 6 months, the waiting list grew longer than I had imagined possible. I hired a part-time assistant, a bright young woman named Lena who had been through her own messy divorce at 25, and then eventually a second counselor to help meet demand. I wasn't just earning a living. I was rebuilding a life that was mine, entirely mine. One afternoon, while sorting through case files, I stumbled across an old photo tucked inside a forgotten folder. It was of me, Grant, and Amelia standing proudly in front of our house, the sun setting behind us, painting everything in hues of gold and hope. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, not with anger, not with regret, just peace. I wasn't that woman anymore, the woman who clung so desperately to a marriage already rotten at its core. I wasn't waiting for someone to come home. I wasn't sacrificing my dreams at the altar of appearances. I had stepped out from the shadows into the light, writing a new story, one that didn't require anyone else's permission to exist. Late that fall, just as the first cool winds began to chase away the heavy southern heat, Amelia came home for a weekend visit from her new job in Charleston. We sat on the porch of my little office, sipping tea as the leaves fell around us in brilliant bursts of gold and red. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said, her voice soft but brimming with emotion. I smiled, feeling something settle deep inside me, Not the fragile happiness of pretending everything was fine, but the solid, steady kind that came from surviving and thriving. In the distance, the bells from St. Michael's chimed, echoing through the cobblestone streets. I looked out over the park, the light catching in Amelia's hair, the warm cup cradled between my hands. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The crispness of early fall lingered in the air the morning of the final hearing. I stood outside the same courthouse where months earlier everything had begun, feeling the cool breeze stir the edges of my light gray dress. Above me, the Charleston sky stretched wide and cloudless, as if the universe itself had decided today would be a day of clarity. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with tension. I walked into the courtroom with Maggie by my side, her presence calm and formidable. Across the aisle, Grant sat with a new lawyer, an older, more seasoned man this time, but it didn't matter. No legal maneuvering could undo what Grant had already destroyed with his own hands. Grant looked even thinner now, his once perfectly tailored suit hanging off his frame like a borrowed shell. He didn't meet my eyes, his shoulders hunched inward, his hands clenching and unclenching against his thighs. The judge, the same sharp-eyed woman from before, entered, her gaze sweeping over the room with clinical precision. The case of Mrs. Evelyn Carter versus Mr. Grant Carter, she announced crisply, and the final battle began. Maggie rose, laying out the evidence with surgical precision. The clear breach of the prenuptial agreement, the misuse of joint funds for personal luxuries and hidden expenses, the documentation of infidelity, financial deceit, and willful betrayal. There were no theatrics, no need for raised voices or dramatics. The facts, cold and devastating, spoke louder than any performance could. Grant's lawyer tried, half-heartedly, to appeal for leniency, tossing out tired phrases about emotional contributions and years of shared life. But even he seemed to know the futility of it. When it was my turn to speak, I stood without hesitation. For more than 2 decades, I began, my voice steady, I gave everything I had to our marriage. My time, my trust. My sacrifices were countless and silent. I built a life with him, around him, for him. And when he found something new, something shinier, he didn't just walk away. He tried to erase me, as if I were nothing more than a chapter to be torn out. I paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. But I am not a chapter, I continued, my voice rising only slightly, fueled by a quiet, unshakable conviction. I am the author of my own story, and today I reclaim the pen. The judge nodded once, her face unreadable. 3 hours later, after reviewing the mountain of evidence one final time, she delivered her ruling. In accordance with the prenuptial agreement and based on overwhelming evidence of misconduct, she declared, the court awards Mrs. Evelyn Carter full ownership of the marital home, retains her individual retirement accounts, and grants her 70% of the joint assets, including all investments and savings accounts. Grant was awarded only his personal belongings and what little remained of his individual checking account. He sat utterly still, as if the ruling had physically pinned him to the chair. I exhaled slowly, not in triumph, not exactly. It wasn't victory I savored. It was the closing of a door that had needed to be shut long ago. As I gathered my papers and rose from my seat, Maggie leaned over and whispered, "Congratulations, Evelyn. You didn't just win. You reclaimed your future." I smiled, small but real. "I know," I whispered back. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the city stretched before me, alive and vibrant and full of promise. I paused for a moment at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the warmth of the day soak into my skin. Grant trailed behind me, his steps slow, his face a portrait of devastation. He stopped a few feet away, his mouth moving as if he wanted to say something, apologize, beg, but no sound came. Only a look, a deep, hollow look of regret, passed between us. I held his gaze for a moment longer than I intended, and then I turned away. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had taken something from him, but because I had finally taken everything back that he had stolen from me. My dignity, my peace, my life. The autumn breeze carried the scent of salt from the harbor and the faint rustle of leaves overhead. A new chapter was waiting, and this time it would be written on my terms. Autumn deepened in Charleston, painting the city in strokes of gold, crimson, and burnt orange. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the salt tang from the harbor. Life, like the seasons, moved on quietly, steadily, and so did I. After the final hearing, the news of my divorce and of Grant's downfall spread through our old social circles like a slow-moving wildfire. Whispers filled every charity luncheon, every book club meeting, every casual brunch where old acquaintances gathered to sip mimosas and trade gossip like currency. But I didn't attend those gatherings anymore. I had no interest in their pity, their curiosity, or their sudden, hollow offers of support. My world had shifted beyond the shallow waters where I once tread carefully, trying not to make waves. Now I sailed in deeper seas on my own terms. The small office I'd rented for Evelyn Carter Life Strategies quickly outgrew itself. Clients came pouring in, women who had been blindsided by betrayals, women who had lost their footing after decades of marriage, women who had been told, subtly and not so subtly, that starting over was a young woman's game. They sat across from me, sometimes clutching crumpled tissues, sometimes laughing through tears, always asking the same trembling question: where do I even begin? And every time I answered the same way: right here, right now. You begin with yourself. Within 8 months, I moved into a larger space, a sunlit corner office with tall windows overlooking Marion Square. I hired Lena full-time, and then another counselor, and eventually expanded into offering small workshops, budgeting after divorce, career rebuilding for women over 40, financial literacy for widows. Word spread beyond Charleston. A few local papers picked up the story, a woman helping other women rebuild after personal loss, and soon my client list included people from neighboring states. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't thriving because someone else allowed me to. I was thriving because I had carved that path with my own 2 hands. One late afternoon, as I closed up the office, my phone buzzed. Amelia. She had been promoted again, now leading the communications team at her company in Charleston, blazing her own path just as fiercely as I had learned to blaze mine. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "I was just thinking about you." I smiled, leaning against the window, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. "What about?" There was a soft laugh on the other end of the line. "I just wanted to say you're my role model." I blinked, feeling the weight of that unexpected confession settle deep in my chest. "Not because you survived everything," Amelia continued, her voice thick with emotion, "but because you turned your pain into something powerful. You taught me that endings aren't failures. They're beginnings, better beginnings." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat was too big, too fierce, too beautiful. "Thank you, sweetheart," I whispered finally, my voice breaking in the best possible way. After we hung up, I stood for a long time, just staring out at the city I had come to love anew. The streets below bustled with life, people laughing, rushing, dreaming, and I realized in a way I had been reborn right alongside them. Some nights, the ghosts of the past still whispered. Memories of Grant, of broken promises and silent dinners, and the suffocating weight of trying to be enough. But they no longer had claws. They no longer hurt. They were just echoes. One weekend, I treated myself to a trip to Asheville, to a cozy little cabin tucked high in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The leaves blazed in every shade of fire, and the air was so clean it hurt to breathe in. Standing on the balcony one crisp morning, wrapped in a thick sweater, sipping hot coffee, I realized something profound. Happiness doesn't come from holding on to the life you were told you should want. It comes from choosing yourself every single day, even when it costs you everything you thought you couldn't live without. I smiled into the rising sun, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet, the open sky above me, the endless possibilities stretching out before me. Evelyn Carter was no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. She was the author. And this time, she was just getting started.